Everyone, welcome to week 2 of our SHSAT study program. So this week's English topic is going to be identifying supporting details. And basically what that means is the passage is going to give you some sort of claim or piece of information, and you're going to need to go back to the passage and find evidence to basically support the claim given in the question. So some tips, right? First of all, you always want to go back to the passage, always. This is very important because oftentimes it happens that, you think you memorized all the information given in the passage, and then it's going to turn out that, you misremembered something or you forgot a piece of evidence that would better support the claim you're trying to support than all the evidence that you actually did memorize. So it's really silly to lose points just because you thought you memorized something that you really didn't. And every point is crucial, so you never want to lose points unless you actually just didn't know how to do the question. So you always have to make sure to go back and look through the passage again. So the second tip is sort of, in the opposite direction. You don't want to take too long. So when you go back, you only want to look at relevant parts of the passage, right? If the claim you're trying to support that topic was discussed in paragraph 1, it doesn't really make sense to go to the last paragraph to look for evidence, because oftentimes these passages are like compartmentalized. So different parts of the passage discuss different subtopics of the general theme. So it doesn't make sense to go back to the end to find information for something that was discussed in the beginning, because it's probably not going to be related. So tip 3 is make sure your answer always supports the claim. So a lot of the time they're going to put true pieces of information and pieces of evidence that you can actually find talked about in the passage that really don't support the claim you're trying to support. So for example, if the question was, why did Stephen take an umbrella outside with him? And the paragraph before it mentions that he went outside with an umbrella, talks about him putting on his shoes. Stephen put on his shoes would not be the correct answer. I mean, obviously this is a silly example, but a lot of the time people actually fall for this trick because, putting on your shoes and taking an umbrella aren't really related. So even though it might be true that he put on his shoes and then he took his umbrella outside, it's not a causation. He didn't take his umbrella because of the fact that he put on his shoes. And basically the most important tip, and for every type of English question, is read the entire question. It happens so often that people only read the first half of the question and they think they know what they're supposed to do, and then it turns out that they don't and they get it wrong. Again, this is a silly reason to get questions or points off, because it's not that you didn't know how to do it, you just didn't want to take the time, the extra 15 seconds to read the entire question to get, to fully understand what you're trying to do. So now we're going to look at some examples. So if you want, you can pause here to read the passage and try to do the questions yourself. I'm not going to read actually the entire passage out loud because that would probably take a while. So, yeah. So, question 31. According to researchers at the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, why is the surface of ice liquid-like rather than a true liquid? So basically, now we want to go back to the passage, but we only want to look for the part that talks about the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory. So if you look, the laboratory is mentioned in this paragraph, so probably our answer is going to show up here. So, for example, in 1996, a chemist at the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory shot electrons and recorded how they rebounded. So this data suggests that the ice remains liquid-like as opposed to becoming a liquid, even at temperatures far below freezing. So if we read further, according to this interpretation of the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory experiments, the molecules move only up and down. If they also move side to side, they would constitute a true liquid. So that's very important, right? We see that the molecules move up and down, which makes the ice liquid-like, but it's not a liquid because they're not moving side to side. They're only moving up and down. So that's basically what's stated in the passage. And now if we look here, because the ice surface molecules vibrate only up and down, that's answer choice B, and that's basically what was said in the passage as well. So B is the correct answer choice. And according to the passage, which of the following undermines the friction theory of slipperiness? So now we're basically looking for the part where it talks about friction and the friction theory of slipperiness. So if you go back up, this is where it talks about friction, right? So past explanations of slipperiness have focused on friction and pressure. So according to the friction theory, this is what we're trying to answer about. We're trying to find a flaw in the friction theory. A skate blade rubs across ice, causing friction. And then this friction produces heat, melting the ice and creating a slippery, microscopically thin layer of water for the skate to glide on. And then it says, the friction theory, however, cannot explain why ice is slippery even when someone stands completely motionless, creating no friction. So basically, this little part is a flaw in the friction theory of slipperiness. And our task was also to find a flaw in this theory. So if we look here, right? Answer choice E, a person wearing flat bottom shoes gliding across an icy surface. That's not what the passage said. It didn't talk about ice cubes fusing together. It talked about electrons bouncing off the ice actually, but like I said, we want to find relevant information to the friction theory. Even though later in the passage it talked about electrons bouncing off ice, that wasn't related to the friction theory of slipperiness, so it's not G. And answer choice H is a person sliding while standing immobile on an icy surface. If you remember, that's actually what it said the flaw was. It said that, they shouldn't slide, but really they do. So the correct answer to 32 is choice H. So again, if you want to try to read the whole passage and answer it yourself, feel free to pause it now and read through it. I'm not going to. Okay, so it's basically asking, what evidence does the author provide to support the last sentence of the passage? So the first thing is we need to look and actually find what the last sentence is. So some observers concluded that had the great debates been broadcast on radio and not on television, Nixon would have won. So now basically we're looking for parts of the passage that talk about, the radio debate being on television. So if we look here to this part, so first of all, the way the two men appeared on television screen, however, may have been as important as what they said. So that talks about the debate being on television, and it sort of says like, okay, well, this is what happens because of the fact that the debate is on television. So Kennedy looked at the camera while answering his questions, appearing to speak directly to his viewers and give them straight answers. This probably made him look like a very suitable and competent presidential candidate. Meanwhile, Nixon was recovering from a severe bout of influenza. And this is just sort of a fact that, most people should know. In case you don't, influenza is just the flu, which is a sickness. And he appeared tense and tired. So this sort of says like, the fact that it was on television, the viewers could see that Kennedy was sort of speaking directly to them, while Nixon, because he was recovering from the flu, looked tired and not ready to answer the questions. So now if we look at the answer choices, right? Kennedy and Nixon drew much smaller audiences for their later debates. It doesn't talk about that. That's not what the passage said. So it's not A. Kennedy and Nixon responded to questions calmly and carefully. Well, so since the last sentence of the paragraph was contrasting the two candidates, right? Saying that they both did the same thing wouldn't be a contrast. That doesn't make a difference between them. So it's not B. So Nixon participated in the debate despite having been recently ill. That's actually what we saw. That's the answer. That's the reason that it said that the television was much more advantageous to Kennedy, because the people could see that he was much more ready to answer the questions, and he looked much more sure, as opposed to Nixon, who was sick and was, tense and tired and not answering the questions to the best of his ability. So C actually works. And answer choice D, Nixon was more experienced and well-known than Kennedy. Well, that actually would not really change anything. That would not make it easier for Kennedy to win the debate, which is basically what the last sentence said. So it's not D, therefore it's answer choice C. So yeah, that's about it for drawing inferences from the passage. So as always, if you have any questions, make sure to leave them in the comments and we'll look through them and answer them. And we'll see you next week.